It's crazy. It's been almost 20 years since that summer, the one that changed everything. I was a park ranger way up north in California, in the Trinity Alps. I'd just turned 22 and finished up at UC Davis with a degree in environmental science. I was young, full of energy, and ready to save the planet, you know. So, I jumped at this seasonal gig, doing trail maintenance and leading nature tours in the middle of nowhere. The drive to the ranger station was my first clue about how isolated this place really was. After I passed through Weaverville, which is the last real town for over 100 miles, it was just these winding mountain roads. Picture super dense forests, the occasional lonely house, and trailheads packed with cars from weekend backpackers. But mostly, it was just me, my beat, up little Volkswagen, and these insane views of rugged, untouched wilderness. 2 hours of driving later, I pulled up to the ranger station. It was this simple A-frame cabin with a shop, tucked away in this high alpine valley. Turns out, they only staffed the place during the busy season. There were 2 permanent rangers, and then 4 college kids like me, hired to help with the trails and lead tours. My fellow seasonal ranger, a girl named Sarah, showed me the ropes. Cell service is basically non-existent up here, she said, pointing around. Even the radio and satellite phone are spotty with these mountains. Our sleeping quarters were in a bunkhouse out back, while the main cabin was the office, radio room, and kitchen, all rolled into one. After I dumped my gear in the bunkhouse, Sarah took me on a short hike to get me familiar with the area. Dense fir and cedar forests clung to these steep slopes that just shot straight up to these bare, rocky peaks. There was still snow in some shady spots, and the creeks were raging with all the meltwater coming down from glaciers way up high. You could feel it in your bones. This was true wilderness. It was a rare and magical place. Over the next week, I got into a routine. I'd wake up before dawn to help with trail maintenance, then do patrols or lead tourist groups on nature hikes in the afternoons. The days were long and physically tough, but I loved it. Every night, I'd crash into my bunk, totally exhausted but feeling really satisfied. On my days off, I loved exploring the backcountry on my own. The solitude and the views were like nothing I'd ever experienced. One Sunday, I decided to climb Mount Eddy, this 9,000-foot peak that supposedly had a killer view. The trail up was all switchbacks through these meadows full of wildflowers, and then a boulder field to the windy summit. When I got to the top, the world just unfolded below me. It was this endless, wrinkled carpet of green forest and gray stone. I sat there for an hour, just watching the sunlight slowly slide down these distant peaks. The hike had taken all day, and by the time I started heading down, the sun was already dipping below the treetops. I picked up my pace, hoping to get back to the ranger station before it got completely dark. These mountains got seriously disorienting at night. But within half a mile, I'd lost the trail somehow and ended up in this dense stand of trees. My anxiety started to spike as the last bit of light faded. Strange noises echoed around me. Was that a branch breaking? My heart was pounding like crazy, and every one of my senses was on high alert, searching for any movement in the brush. I realized I was working myself into a full-blown panic, so I stopped and took a deep breath. I forced myself to calm down and started heading downhill, knowing I would eventually pick up the trail. By the time the lights of the ranger station finally came into view, I was exhausted and drenched in sweat, but the relief was overwhelming. After that little episode, I made sure to give myself plenty of time to get out of the backcountry before sunset. No more close calls for me. As June came to a close, more and more hikers started showing up in the high country, eager to get their early season adventures in. Our workload ramped up as we prepped campsites and maintained trails for the coming summer rush. One afternoon, the radio crackled to life. A visitor had injured themselves falling into a creek up on Mount Eddy. I knew the trail like the back of my hand at that point, so I hustled up those switchbacks and reached the spot in under an hour. The woman had sprained her ankle pretty badly and couldn't put any weight on it. After I stabilized the injury, I helped her slowly limp down to the trailhead where her husband was waiting, totally freaking out. My supervisor commended me for the quick response. Word of the incident must have gotten around, because over the next few days, I noticed more hikers on the Mount Eddy Trail giving me these knowing, grateful looks. It felt good, you know, helping people appreciate these wild places while staying safe. Then came the 4th of July weekend. The weather was perfect, and it seemed like every single person in California decided to descend on the Trinity Alps. Our little crew was running rag, managing the crowds, cleaning up campsites, answering a million questions, and rescuing the occasional hiker who'd bitten off more than they could chew. I was proud of how we all pulled together as a team, though. We handled it. By Sunday evening, the holiday crowds had vanished as quickly as they'd appeared. We all collapsed in the bunkhouse, totally wiped but looking forward to the slower pace of midsummer. Little did we know, things were about to get seriously weird. I was about 10 miles into my weekly patrol of the northern trails when I first spotted him. This guy was stumbling along the path, his skinny body all hunched over like he was fighting against some invisible force. Even from a distance, I could tell he was in rough shape. "Hey there," I called out. "Are you okay?" The man jerked his head up, his eyes wide with the panic of an animal hearing a predator's footsteps. His eyes were sunken and bloodshot. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but only this choked gurgle came out. I rushed over just as his legs started to buckle. "Whoa, easy now," I said, grabbing him under his shoulders before he could collapse. "I've got you." He was disturbingly gaunt under his torn, filthy clothes. "Monsters," he croaked, coming for me. "Look at me," I said firmly, trying to sound calm and in control. "You're safe now. I'm a park ranger. My name is Emily. I'm going to help you, okay?" The man's breathing was coming in these ragged gasps. I needed to get some food and water into him, fast, before he went into shock. I lowered him onto a flat rock at the side of the trail and knelt beside him. I unscrewed my canteen and held it to his cracked lips. "Small sips," I told him. He managed a few swallows before breaking into a coughing fit, but some color started to return to his grayish face. I dug some trail mix out of my pack and coaxed him into eating a handful of the nuts and raisins. As the initial delirium started to fade, he seemed to focus on me for the first time. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I'm Ethan. "Nice to meet you, Ethan," I said with a reassuring smile. "Now just rest for a minute, you're going to be okay?" But Ethan's eyes took on this vacant, haunted look again. No, it's still coming. I can feel it," he mumbled, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "There are things in these woods, evil things." I glanced uneasily at the silent trees surrounding us. Ethan's words were starting to get to me. "Ethan, look at me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You were lost out here, right? The wilderness can play tricks on your mind." He seized my arm with unexpected strength. "You have to believe me," he pleaded, his eyes wide with terror. "I saw it take James." "Oh God," the screaming. "Who's James?" I asked gently, When Ethan just stared ahead, lost in some horrific memory, I tried again. What did you see? Ethan's whole body began to tremble. The monster, pale flesh, razor claws. It dragged him away into the darkness. His voice trailed off, his eyes darting around wildly. The poor guy was clearly traumatized, but whether his ramblings were based on a real experience or some kind of mental break, I couldn't be sure. For now, I just needed to keep him calm. Okay, just take deep breaths, I soothed. We'll get you out of here soon. I'm going to call for a helicopter evacuation. I stepped away and radioed in our coordinates, requesting emergency transport. The dispatcher said the weather was preventing any air access until the following morning. We'd have to hunker down here for the night. As the sun dipped below the ridgeline, I gathered wood and kindling to start a fire. Its crackling warmth seemed to lull Ethan into a daze. I boiled water and made us both some hot soup from my rations. Ethan stared blankly at the flames as he sipped. When he finished eating, I spread out my sleeping bag and mat. You should rest, I said. Ethan didn't resist as I eased him down. His eyes were already fluttering closed from exhaustion, but he continued to mumble disjointedly. It won't stop, coming for me. Found me again. I squeezed his hand. Sleep, I said softly. No one's going to hurt you now. He was out in minutes. I added more wood to the fire and leaned back against a log, facing him. The last rays of sun faded away, leaving us cloaked in darkness. I checked that my pistol was loaded and within reach. Not that I actually thought I'd need protection from monsters. Poor Ethan had just cracked under the strain of exposure and hunger. Still, his ravings sent a shiver through me. I peered out into the impenetrable night, pressing in around our little camp. With the firelight dancing eerily on the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched by unseen, menacing eyes. The next morning, I was up before dawn, anxious to get Ethan to safety. The poor guy obviously needed medical care and some serious psychological counseling. Part of me wondered if this whole monster thing was all in his head, or if something truly dangerous lurked in these woods. But I pushed those thoughts aside. As the distant thrum of chopper blades approached, I felt a wave of relief. Right on schedule, the rescue helicopter appeared above the treetops. I gently shook Ethan awake and helped him to his wobbly legs. It's time to go, I said. The helicopter is here for you. Ethan gripped my arm, his eyes darting around fearfully. Do you hear it? He whispered. The monster's close. I can feel it watching. You're safe now, I promise, I said, keeping my voice calm and leading him firmly toward the clearing. No more monsters. You're going to the hospital. He stayed huddled against me as we ducked under the whirling blades. Once Ethan was buckled into his seat, I stepped back and gave him a reassuring wave. But as the chopper lifted off the ground, Ethan screamed over the deafening engine. It sees me. Oh God, it's coming. His hysterical pleas faded away as the helicopter rose above the treetops and sped off. I stood there watching it disappear, my heart aching for the broken man inside. With a heavy sigh, I turned and headed back down the trail alone. Ethan clearly had some severe psychological trauma, though whether it was based in reality or delusion, I couldn't be sure. I said a silent prayer for his recovery as I hiked. A strange unease crept over me. The forest was eerily still and watchful. I shook off the feeling, quickening my pace. Ethan's ramblings were affecting me more than I cared to admit. Focus, I told myself. You know these woods like the back of your hand. A raven's cry made me jump. Get a grip, Emily. Still, I couldn't ignore that prickle on the back of my neck, like unseen eyes tracking me. I glared into the underbrush defiantly. See, nothing there. You're letting fear get the best of you. By late afternoon, the silence felt suffocating. I paused, turning in a slow circle. Nothing looked wrong, yet my instincts screamed that something was wrong. I fumbled for my radio, but got only static. Swallowing hard, I continued on, pacing my breaths. You're almost to the ranger station. Don't lose it now. A crack, like snapping branches, whipped me around, my hand flying to my holster. Adrenaline spiked through me. Easy, girl. Probably just a deer. Still, I quickened my steps. The trees themselves seemed to creep nearer, the light fading as their limbs wove tighter overhead. Another sharp crack, even closer this time. I broke into a run, my heart hammering against my ribs. The trail tunneled ahead into featureless darkness. Rasping breaths reverberated my own, and glimpses of pale, muscular movement flashed between the trees. No, I realized with dizzying horror, those weren't reverberations. Something was right behind me. I screamed as a dark shape hurtled past within inches, kicking up dirt and leaves. It was moving with impossible speed. The radio was useless. No one was coming to help. I needed to hide now. I veered off the trail, crashing into the thick brush. Thorns and branches lashed at my skin as I plowed through the shrubbery. I found a small hollow beneath some boulders and dove inside, clamping my hands over my mouth to stifle my gasps. I could only pray the thing hadn't seen where I went. Frozen in terrified silence, I strained to hear any sound of pursuit over my own thundering pulse. The forest had gone deathly quiet. Minutes crawled by with no sign of disturbance. Finally, I risked it, sliding out my pistol. The weight of it steadied me slightly, but I knew bullets would only slow this thing, not kill it. I had to make it to the ranger station. Hidden beneath a rocky overhang, I tried to control my ragged breathing as the sun slowly sank below the treetops. The usual forest noises that faded at dusk were replaced by other, more disturbing sounds: crackling branches, bouncing cries, guttural muttering just out of range. Whatever was out there hunting me was no ordinary animal. My hands shook as I checked my pistol's magazine for the dozenth time. 8 rounds left. Useless against this thing, if I didn't get a clean headshot, which seemed unlikely given the speed it moved. Spying between the branches, I searched desperately for some sign of my pursuer. There, a fleeting change of movement. I squinted into the growing darkness. One shadow detached itself from the rest, loping through the underbrush. It paused, tilting its head as if sniffing the air. My blood turned to ice as it swiveled, unnaturally, to peer directly at my hiding spot with reflective, inhuman eyes. In the fading light, I glimpsed a bald, skeletal figure crouched on all fours. I slapped a hand over my mouth to hold in a scream. I finally understood Ethan's delirious ravings. This thing was real, and it had my scent. I huddled motionless as the creature slunk closer, my mind reeling with how such a being could exist. But I shoved those thoughts aside. I needed to survive the next 5 minutes, not unravel cosmic mysteries. The thing paused just yards away, its head twitching from side to side as it searched for me. I forced myself not to flinch as its black gaze swept over my thicket. With a guttural hiss, it bounded away into the underbrush. I nearly sobbed in relief. The reprieve would be brief, though. I had to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible while I still had some light. I eased from my hiding spot and took off running. Twigs and stones cut into my feet, but I didn't slow down. Better injured than dead. Behind me, I could hear the unmistakable sounds of pursuit. I pushed harder, even as my burning lungs begged for rest. When I came across a small creek, I jumped in without hesitation, hoping the water would confuse my scent trail. Static buzzed from my radio as I burst from the trees into a moonlit meadow. Mayday, mayday. I gasped into the handset. Ranger in distress, requesting immediate backup at. The only reply was garbled white noise. No one was coming to the rescue this time. Up ahead loomed a granite cliff face. I'd have to detour around it. As I paused to get my bearings, a guttural cry rang out, closer than expected. I fired 2 shots blindly toward the sound before stumbling off. Later, I found myself collapsed on a stony outcrop, heaving for breath. The adrenaline that had fueled my headlong flight was spent. As the moon rose, the H's of my abused body screamed for acknowledgement. But rest wasn't an option. Somewhere behind me, the creature waited. I ran blindly through the darkness, my throat raw from screaming into the void. The thing pursuing me moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows. Its unnatural mutters reverberated around the trees, impossible to pinpoint. Exhaustion seeped into my bones, but I didn't dare stop. To pause even for a moment was to surrender to the horrors lurking in this forest. Thorns tore at my skin as I crashed through the underbrush. I focused on the sting, using the pain to anchor myself against the panic threatening to overwhelm me. The dark forest seemed to press in from all sides, as I staggered aimlessly through the night. My throat was raw and lungs burning from hours of screaming into the void for help, but no one was coming. The only reply was the mocking echo of my own panicked cries through the trees. And always, just out of sight but drawing relentlessly nearer, the unnatural mutters of the thing pursuing me. I lost all track of time and direction during that desperate, lonely flight. The monstrous creature herded me like prey, staying in the shadows, but relentlessly driving me forward through the trackless woods. Thorns and branches tore viciously at my skin and clothes, shredding my uniform shirt to tatters. My ripped and bloody boots slipped on loose stones as I scrambled blindly on, barely keeping my footing. The iron taste of fear coated my tongue. I couldn't keep this up much longer. My exhausted limbs grew heavier with each frantic step, reflexes dulling dangerously. But to stop, even for a moment, meant surrendering to the unspeakable horror trailing me. So, I forced leaden legs to keep churning, lungs to keep pulsating, focused only on surviving the next minute and the one after that. Just before dawn, I stumbled out of a thicket and found myself in a rocky creek bed. My overwhelmed mind took long seconds to even comprehend it wasn't more endless forest. I stood swaying, ears ringing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Gradually, the sound of flowing water registered. Salvation. I followed the beckoning murmur until my rubbery legs finally gave out on the smooth, damp stones lining the creek's bank. I collapsed in an ungainly heap, every muscle quivering with utter fatigue. The frigid creek water provided blessed relief against my hot, grimy skin. As I lay there, with enormous effort, I rolled over and began splashing handfuls of water onto my face and arms, washing away some of the sweat and dirt caked on me. The chill of it helped pierce the fog shrouding my mind. As adrenaline from my panicked flight drained rapidly away, the true depth of my exhaustion became apparent. It was tempting to just lay my head down on the wet stones and give in to the desperate longing for rest, if only for a moment. My swollen eyelids begged to close against the gray pre-dawn light. But I couldn't sleep, not yet. To let my guard down was to surrender myself completely to the horrors still lurking out in the darkness of that forest. There would be time for rest later, if I survived. With a pained groan, I pushed myself up to a sitting position. Though every fiber of my being screamed in protest, I forced myself to take stock of my situation. As morning approached, I needed to get oriented and move. My strength was nearly spent, but I couldn't lose hope. Shivering, I wrapped my arms around myself and stared down at the tattered remains of my uniform shirt. It hung off me in filthy rags, leaving my scratched and bruised arms bare. My ripped hiking boots were stained with blood from countless nicks and scratches accumulated during that hellish night flight. I bent stiffly to check them, hissing as the cuts on my feet protested. Nothing serious, but they would slow me down. Fumbling at my belt with trembling, damp hands, I unclipped my pistol and brought it unsteadily up to inspect. Just 2 rounds left in the magazine. 2 slim bullets were all that stood between me and an unimaginably gruesome end. Fear twisted my gut, but I forced a fierce determination to temper it. Making those shots count was my only chance. Taking a deep, bracing breath, I gazed up at the lightning sky, visible through the tangled branches overhead. It was time to move. With monumental effort, I pushed up onto shaky legs, swaying as dizziness threatened to pull me back down. I stood, gripping a tree, waiting for the sensation to pass, a prayer on my lips. Please, let this night end. Let me see the sun again. The diffused gray light of pre-dawn revealed little of my surroundings. I stared blankly through the tangled branches, disoriented and lost. After a night spent crashing blindly through these woods, panic and exhaustion had shattered any sense of direction during that hellish flight. Now, as the promise of a new day slowly permeated the sky overhead, I realized I had become completely turned around in the darkness. The trees provided no familiar landmarks to guide me. I closed my eyes, swaying slightly as I tried to steady my ragged breathing. I had to orient myself before moving another step. Kneeling carefully, to avoid putting weight on my cut and blistered feet, I studied the forest floor, searching for signs to read the land. A ridge of sloping rocks led down to the creek beside me. Water flowed from higher elevations to lower ones. If I followed this creek downstream, it should lead to bigger rivers with trails. Craning my neck, I next inspected the trees themselves. Moss clung heavily to the north side of the trunks, while the south-facing bark remained bare. If the dawn light was coming from the east, as expected, then the moss indicated that direction was north. I needed to go generally south and west. I rose slowly, ignoring the trembling in my exhausted limbs. The scant information gleaned from my surroundings would have to guide me for now. Without proper gear or daylight, there was no way to be completely sure. But I had no other choice but to trust my basic compass skills. I could only pray they didn't lead me in worse circles. Gripping my pistol in clammy hands, I chose my path and started walking. Each step was agony across my torn soles, but I gritted my teeth against the pain, moving as swiftly as injuries allowed. Better to suffer than to wait here, like a lamb for slaughter. Despite the rising sun at my back, the shadows between the trees seemed to creep closer, shuddering with hidden menace. I strained all my senses for signs of the creature's presence. Thus far, the morning remained hushed, but for the gurgle of the creek and tentative morning birdsong. It was soothing to hear those normal forest sounds again after the eerie silence of the night. Perhaps the return of daylight had driven the monster into hiding, for now, but I harbored no illusion that I was free of it. No, it was simply biding its time, letting me expend precious energy stumbling towards imagined safety. It would trail just out of sight, toying with me, waiting for exhaustion to deliver me helplessly into its claws. The thought sent a chill colder than the creek water down my spine. I could not let my guard down, not for an instant. Every snapped twig and rustle of brush set my nerves thrumming like electrified wires. I walked lightly, stopping frequently to listen. Each time, the forest held its breath. Eventually, my own breathing and heartbeat roared deafeningly loud in the absence of other sounds. I clutched my gun, slick palm leaving condensation on the grip. The morning wore on as I hiked aimlessly through the tangled woods. With no trail to follow, I clambered over moss, slicked logs, and pushed through grasping bushes, feeling utterly lost. As the adrenaline that had fueled my all-night flight sputtered out, despair crept over me. I was alone and being hunted in this labyrinth of trees, with no idea how to escape. When I stumbled upon an old campsite, my heart leaped. Circled by stones was the unmistakable outline of where a tent had stood. Next to it, a trail wound away into the forest. Hope fluttered in my chest. Trails always led somewhere. I whispered a prayer as I stepped onto the narrow, overgrown path. Let it guide me to the ranger station. To safety, please. The surrounding trees seemed to crowd together, branches interlacing overhead to block out the morning sun. An unnatural silence gripped the forest, as if it was holding its breath. The complete absence of birdsong or squirrels scrambling up trunks unnerved me. It was as if the entire woodland was a coiled spring, ready to unleash violent chaos. I walked as swiftly as my battered feet could manage, hyper-aware of each rustle or crack. The trail gave focus to my movement, but also funneled me predictably forward. Easy prey for the predator that surely still stalked me, somewhere in the watching trees. My eyes constantly searched the shadowy spaces between trunks, searching for any sign of unnatural movement. By the time I glimpsed distant buildings through the leaves, I was stumbling badly. Tears of relief streamed down my grimy cheeks. I had made it. My ordeal was almost over. Mustering the very last of my strength, I broke into a limping run. Each impact sent shockwaves of pain up my legs, but I gritted my teeth and pushed onward. Safety called, so close now. Closer and closer the buildings grew. I could make out the familiar shapes. There was the main office, the generator shed, my home for the past 2 summers. I was nearly there. With no warning, a piercing howl tore through the air, just feet behind me. My head whipped around to see a pale, skinny, humanoid shape hurtling out from the trees, claws outstretched. I screamed and fired wildly over my shoulder as I dove off the trail, hearing the shots crack harmlessly into the trees. Heart seizing in my chest, I stumbled and crashed hard to the forest floor. For one paralyzing moment, I lay winded. Then, the heavy footsteps nearby jolted me upright. Ignoring my limbs' screaming protests, I scrambled to my feet and sprinted for those refuge buildings, now almost close enough to touch, glimmering in the sunlight filtering through the trees. So close, so close. Please let me make it. I burst through the front door of the ranger station, the solid wood frame nearly coming off its hinges as I slammed it closed behind me. My heart was hammering violently in my chest as I frantically threw my full weight against the door, struggling to turn the lock with my trembling, bloody fingers. A split second later, a heavy thud collided with the door from outside, making the whole thing shudder on its hinges. I jumped back with a gasp, pulse roaring in my ears. The flimsy lock wouldn't hold it for long. Pure animal panic flooded my veins as I searched the familiar surroundings of the ranger station's main room, desperately searching for anything I could use to further barricade the entrance. My eyes landed on the old wooden desk in the corner, weighed down by a bulky filing cabinet next to it. That would have to work. I rushed over and, with almost inhuman strength born of complete and utter terror, I gripped the edges of the heavy furniture and heaved. They screeched in protest across the floor until they blocked the door. It wouldn't hold out the monster for long, but I just needed time. Time to grab a weapon and call for help. Outside, furious blows began hammering relentlessly against the station's walls as the pale creature tried to break in and get to me. I could hear the boarded front window splintering inwards under the heavy assault. I ducked instinctively and raced for the back room that housed the emergency gun locker. My boots slipped in the blood trail I'd left across the floorboards. I struggled for traction, arms windmilling to stay upright. More bone, jarring impacts reverberated through the small station's interior. The whole building seemed to shudder with the force of the battering it was enduring. Finally, I stumbled into the storage room, towards the gray metal locker along the back wall. The combination lock trembled in my slick, red, stained fingers. Blood pounded behind my eyes, roaring like the ocean surf. Through it, the sounds of shattering glass and splintering wood came from the other room. The creature was nearly through. I forced myself to breathe, to focus, as I carefully turned the combination dial, picturing the memorized numbers in my mind. On the third try, the locker clicked open. Inside lay a pump-action shotgun and rows of ammunition boxes. I grabbed the shotgun with one hand while the other scooped up boxes of shells indiscriminately. A loud scraping came from behind the storage room's door. My head jerked up and I froze. It was inside. "Please work," I begged silently as I turned on the radio and keyed the sauce frequency. But only static greeted me. The surrounding mountains were still blocking any signal. The heavy slams against the exterior walls had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The creature had stopped trying to get in, at least for the moment. Gripping the useless radio tighter, I slowly approached the barricaded front door. My light steps seemed to echo thunderously in the quiet. Pressing my ear tentatively against the wood, I listened hard, past the frantic pounding of blood in my ears. No sound came from outside, except the nervous twittering of birds returning to the trees. No heavy footsteps, no panting or scrape of claws, just stillness. A flicker of desperate hope rose in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, I had managed to elude the monster after all. Perhaps it had given up the hunt and retreated. But no, I couldn't let blind optimism lower my guard now. Not until I saw, with my own eyes, its death. Still, as the minutes ticked by in silence, I considered risking a look outside. I could leave the safety of the station to be rescued, or wait here for who knows how long until help arrived. It was a gamble either way. I hesitated, chewing my stubbled nails anxiously. Live or die, the choice was mine. After several tense minutes spent pacing and weighing my options, I braced my nerves. Gripping my gun with slick palms, I shuffled the heavy cabinet aside and cracked open the front door. The warm light of morning spilled in, calming my frayed senses. The familiar porch and sun-dappled trees looked so ordinary, so safe. I lifted my boot to step outside. A wet, squelching sound made me look down. My soul was soaked in a crimson puddle seeping from underneath the door. Heart seizing, I swung the door wider. Dark blood streaked the weathered boards in erratic patterns, but no body lay there. Relief washed over me as the obvious conclusion surfaced. The creature must have been mortally wounded somehow. It couldn't have gotten far. I eased the rest of the way outside, stepping cautiously onto the blood-streaked boards of the porch. My eyes tracked the sporadic trail of dark drops leading off the steps and winding into the encroaching trees. Though every instinct screamed to stay barricaded inside, I knew I had to follow it. I needed to see the creature's broken corpse with my own eyes, to know beyond any shred of doubt that the horror that had pursued me relentlessly through the night was well and truly dead. Readying my frayed nerves and gripping the pistol tighter to steel my shaking hands, I stepped off the porch and crossed the short distance to the tree line. Passing into the shadows beneath the bowing canopy, I maneuvered carefully over gnarled roots and fallen branches, gun aimed and ready. Filtered morning light dappled the forest floor. Birds twittered cheerfully in the branches overhead, yet tension still coiled tightly in my muscles, half expecting the beast to leap out from behind a broad trunk at any second. The sporadic trail of dark crimson droplets wound on through the underbrush ahead, each one vividly pronounced against the verdant green. I traced their erratic path slowly, pulse thundering in my ears. Despite the tranquil scene, the surrounding ferns and bushes showed no signs of disturbance, no broken stems or scattered leaves to indicate the creature's passing. Only those small, ominous splashes of red to guide me onward. Suddenly, the grim trail ended, the dots fading out 20 yards into the woods. I froze, eyes widening in dismay, breath catching sharply in my throat. No. No, 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 no. It wasn't possible. Not after everything I had suffered and survived to reach this supposed refuge. There, lying crumpled in a ravaged heap of mangled flesh and fur, was the massive body of a black bear, remnants of its entrails strewn about, neck twisted back on itself from being snapped. My mind reeled in horror at what I was seeing. This carcass was fresh, killed just this morning. I had been deceived. A soft rustle sounded from somewhere overhead. My head jerked up towards the sound. Before I could stop myself, there, perched on a low, moss-shrouded branch, crouched the impossibly gaunt and pale body of the creature. Its wet, gray flesh glistened in the sunlight. I stood paralyzed in the glare of those chilling obsidian eyes, unable to breathe, to think, to do anything but stare helplessly as the creature silently dropped to the forest floor in front of me, blocking any hope of escape. The creature stalked towards me, its movements unnaturally fluid and graceful, like a predator certain of its impending kill. My heel caught on a tree root as I scrambled backward, arms flailing. I toppled over the savage remains of the bear's carcass and crashed painfully onto the hard forest floor. The impact jarred my senses, scattering the sickening paralysis of fear that had seized my mind. Adrenaline surged through my veins, lending strength to my trembling muscles. I couldn't give up yet. Gritting my teeth, I pushed through the pain and clawed my way back to my feet. I had beaten impossible odds to survive this far. I would not die whimpering like a lamb at slaughter. The creature paused its measured approach, tilting its hairless head with interest as I backed away. Its void, black eyes tracked my movement hungrily beneath a pale, elongated skull. The faint morning light gleamed wetly off its muscles beneath leathery skin as it moved, razor claws flexing eagerly. I couldn't outrun this thing on my weakened legs. I needed a weapon if I had any hope of escaping its clutches. Spying a fallen branch within reach, I darted for it as the creature tensed to pounce. My hands closed around solid wood just as it sprung. I swung with all my remaining might, adrenaline lending strength to my exhausted limbs. The branch cracked with a resounding thwack across the monster's skull. Howling, it recoiled sideways, clawed hands grasping its face as inky blood streamed from the scalp wound down its face. I had dazed it, but not for long. This was my only chance. I lunged desperately for my fallen pistol, fingers scrabbling in the leaf litter until they finally closed around the grip. Whirling back towards the creature, I fired off 2 successive rounds, point blank into its chest. The gunshots boomed deafeningly between the trees. The creature's shriek of pain and fury pierced my eardrums like jagged metal, yet it remained upright, limbs coiling. My eyes widened. The small rounds had impacted pale flesh, but passed clean through rather than stopping it. Still, dark blood now seeped from multiple wounds. I had injured it, if not killed it, perhaps just enough to slow it a precious few seconds so I could escape. I pushed myself up and ran, my weakened legs screaming in protest as I weaved drunkenly between the trees. Each impact sent shock waves of bone, deep pain jolting through my battered body, but I forced leaden feet to keep churning, lungs gasping raggedly for air. The creature's enraged cries reverberated behind as it gave pursuit, driving me onward faster through sheer desperation. Safety was so close now. Just ahead, past the tree line. I could make it if I just kept moving. The shape of the ranger station emerged from between the trees, less than 50 yards ahead. It was so close now, yet those last few dozen yards may as well have been miles with the creature in pursuit just behind me. Still, I now had a chance. I repeated the desperate mantra again and again in my mind, willing leaden legs to keep churning. Just a little farther. Don't stop. You can do this. The station grew tantalizingly near with each stride, but so too did the frenzied howls of the wounded creature loping after me. It was slowed by injuries but not dead, not nearly enough to stop its relentless hunt. 20 yards now. 10. My lungs burned like fire in my heaving chest. Still, I pushed harder. With a final, explosive burst, I ran up the creaking steps of the porch and slammed bodily into the solid wooden door. Searing pain exploded through my shoulder from the impact, but I barely registered it as I grasped desperately for the handle. The guttural roars were nearly upon me as I wrenched the door inward and dove across the threshold. Somehow, I found the coordination to turn, even as I fell, and slam my palm against the bolt lock, throwing it home seconds later. The entire door shuddered violently under a heavy collision as the enraged creature flung itself against the barrier now separating us. The walls reverberated from the force of the blows as it shrieked and clawed wildly on the other side. But this time, the strong frame held firm. Dropping my forehead against the floorboards in dizzying relief, I gasped for air between ragged sobs. The frenzied pounding soon faded away into the forest as the creature retreated, for now at least. I was safe. I had survived, against all odds. As my breathing slowed and adrenaline seeped from my veins, the full weight of utter exhaustion pressed down, luring me toward unconsciousness. But I couldn't rest yet. Gripping the door handle weakly, I used it to pull my battered body upright. Swaying, I leaned there, gathering my strength as the familiar confines of the station swam around me. Sitting here now, it's surreal to think it's been almost 20 years since that terrifying experience in the forest. In some ways, it feels like yesterday. The images and sensations are still so viscerally burned into my mind. I still occasionally jerk awake at night from nightmares of glowing eyes and pale flesh flashing between the dark trees. But during my waking hours, the memories have dulled and faded somewhat, become almost detached, like something that happened to another person. It's the only way my psyche can process such trauma, by compartmentalizing it into its own small box in my mind, closed off and separated from my present reality. After the creature finally retreated back into the depths of the forest, I managed to barricade myself inside the small ranger station. Adrenaline spent, I sank to the floor and slipped into unconsciousness. I awoke hours later to the distant thrum of helicopter blades and glimpsed flashing lights through the window. Apparently, my missed mandatory check-ins over the radio had triggered the emergency response protocols when I didn't confirm I was okay. I was airlifted out of those remote woods to a hospital in the nearest town. I spent about a week there, recovering physically from hypothermia, dehydration, and my various wounds, while also meeting with counselors to recover emotionally from my trauma. It was a grueling process, but I'm beyond grateful I pulled through intact. The medical staff were confounded by my mutterings about what had actually happened out there. In the end, lacking any evidence, officials chalked it up to delirium from a wild animal attack and severe disorientation. I eventually stopped trying to convince them it was more. These days, I avoid going anywhere near the wilderness, sticking to safe, populated city parks for my outdoor time. After what I endured, the isolation and unchecked danger of the deep woods unnerves me to my core. I doubt I'll ever be able to wander remote, forested areas freely alone again. But the memories, as faded as they've become, remind me that I made it through my own personal hell once already. Though I still believe in the existence of the creature, its reality forever remains unproven to anyone else. My pleas for acknowledgement fall on deaf, skeptical ears. No one else alive knows what I faced out there as I ran for my life under the branches of those impending pines. And so, to the wider world, it remains simply the delusion of a trauma-stricken mind. But I know the truth. I felt its rancid breath on my neck and stared into eyes that reflected only primal hunger. Something unnatural lurks beneath the gentle mask of the forest. And I know, without a doubt, that it's still roaming and hunting. No one else may believe such delusions, but I know what haunts the dark shadows between the trees. I was one of the lucky ones. Others may not escape its grasp as I did,